Joey and I have known each other for about 14 years, I think now, and they've become very good friends to us. And there's really only one thing that we can't see eye to eye on, and that's really which eye should focus.
Go Hawks!
Yeah, there you go. That's the one place where we can't agree. But Joey and Carla are national ministry overseers for Growing Families International, and that's the organization that provides teaching material that Roxy and I teach to parents here in the community. They are also, I don't know if you would call yourselves that or not, but we would call you missionaries across the United States. And tonight they'll be leading the workshop that we have here at Smithville. And so really, I want to meet with you, my good friend, Joey Lincoln. Father, we just anticipate what you have to share with us this morning. We know that it's something you want us to hear. As Todd mentioned, obedience is so critical in the life of Adam, of Noah, and of each one of us. And so we pray that we would hear what Joey has to share, and that it would soak into us, and we would appreciate and appropriate it as a practice. And we give this to you this night in Jesus' name.
Thank you, brother. What a privilege to be here. I can't believe that Todd let me have his moment. Let me share with you, but before I begin, I got to tell you that it's a treat to be here. I travel around an awful lot. In fact, we left a week ago and won't be home until mid-November, something like that. But we're in church every week someplace, whether preaching or just worshiping. And this is like the church that I grew up in. And I get to be in a lot of large churches, but this is a privilege to go back home and hear great singing by God's people. So thank you for letting me just join and worship with you. Obedient children is an interesting thing. Is it a myth or a possibility that you can raise an obedient child? Now, that could be a scary thought because I see there's some children sitting here this morning. And some of you parents might be thinking, okay, how do I get the duct tape out? How do I tie them down? Are there any bungee cords I can use so that I have no idea what he's going to say? But let me use that great philosopher, Dear Abby, as our text. I clipped this out of the newspaper back in February of 1990. It says this: am I behind the times or what, Abby? This past weekend, some friends and their children were at my home. The mother told her little boy, who happened to be age 10, to go sit down and watch TV in the den while she and I visited. The boy turned around and said to his mother, "Just who died and made you king?" She ignored him, so he repeated to make sure that the mother heard him. I turned around and looked at the boy, then at his mother to see what she was going to do, which was nothing. My children are grown now, Abby, but if one of mine had dared to talk to me that way, he wouldn't have been able to sit down for a week or two. I was telling someone else about this smart-mouthed kid and how amazed I was that his mother just let it pass. And I was told, well, that's just the way that most kids are being raised today. Abby, am I behind the times? Is that really the way most kids are being raised today? I really worry about that boy. His parents bend over backward to see that he gets everything he wants, and I just know that the first time the police call his parents, they're going to wonder where they went wrong or why society is picking on their son. Is this really the acceptable way for a 10-year-old being? The sad part is, as I said before, this was 1990. 21 years ago, what is a 31-year-old boy like this like today? That scares me. Because I think every parent, when they have their child, they start off looking at that little boy. See, when I had my son Michael, who's now 30 years old, I looked at him, he came popping out of that womb, and the nurse said, "Here, hold him." I said, "I'm afraid I'm going to break him. I'm not touching him." But then the nurse said, "You're holding him. You got to bond with him." So I'm holding this little boy. I'm like, okay, what do we do? What do we do? You know what? He was okay. I didn't break him, but then I realized at that moment that he needed some training, he needed some guidance. And I don't think there's a parent here today that wants their child to talk back to them. I don't think there's a parent or grandparent that wants their children or their grandchildren to be disobedient. They really want to be obedient. But as I travel around and we teach with growing families all around the country, what I find is that many parents don't have a clue what an obedient child is. In fact, what's really interesting is that if you have a wife who grows up in this home here, how she was raised, and then you have dad who grows up over here in this home and how he's raised, you bring the two together, they're walking into this marriage with a suitcase full of issues of how they were raised, and now they're supposed to figure together how we're going to raise this obedient child. Before you can figure out how you're going to raise an obedient child, you've got to ask, what is an obedient child? And mom and dad typically come together and have different definitions. Let's start with the Bible. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. It says, children, obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right. Just stop right there. It is right for every child to obey their parents in the Lord. In fact, if you look at that, it's not an option. It's not even a directive. It is a command by God that children are supposed to obey their parents. When my son was born, and I have two daughters too, what's interesting is that neither of those three were born with an obedient gene. They didn't get that. You know, God did not put that cog in there that said, here's how to be obedient. Because God expects parents to teach your kids to be obedient. At that point, you've got to ask, what is obedience? In fact, Daniel Webster has a really good definition. Let's look at it. It's up here on the screen for you. It says this. To be ruled or controlled. And let's just stop right there. How many want to be ruled or controlled by somebody? We got an issue. And it also goes on and says to follow the guidance of another. Well, that's okay. I like to follow the people, especially with the pilot car that says, follow me as you're going through construction zone. Okay, I can do that. Okay? How about to be submissive to restraint? Sometimes. That's helpful. That's valuable. Colossians chapter 3, verse 20. It says, children, obey your parents in everything. Everything is a pleases the Lord. How does obedience look in real life? Let me take you, if you got your Bibles, you can turn to the book of Samuel with me. It's going to be on the screen for you to read along if you want, but I'm going to be reading from the New International Version, the one that I like. And 1 Samuel chapter 3 is a really good story that I think helps the dad and his wife to get on the same page in raising their kids. Let me give you just a little bit of background to start with. In this book, in this story, it's named after Samuel, boy Samuel. But what's interesting is that Samuel was born to Hannah. Hannah could not have children. Hannah was one of two wives to Elkanah. There's Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah could have children, and Hannah couldn't. Well, Peninnah was like one of those, I shouldn't say that in the church, should I? Okay. I can do this, you can't see what I got. I got kids, you don't have kids yet. Cool, but when you're married to the same man, that's a real problem. Now, I'm not going into that. That's Todd's job. But Hannah was so frustrated she couldn't have kids. And so she went into the house of God like this. She went into the temple and she went in there and prayed while Eli, the priest, he saw her. She was down on her knees probably. She was praying and praying and praying. He said, oh Lord, please God, give me a baby. I pray God that you would bless me with a child. Like just the visions. And as she's going through this, the priest, the high priest, whose name is Eli, old guy who could barely see, that takes away your time, okay? You can see well. He comes along and he says, woman, why are you drunk in God's house? She says, I'm praying, beseeching God that He would give me a child. Okay? He says, good, go home and may God bless you. She goes home. She conceives. But one thing she did say is that if God gives me a child, I'm going to take and give it back to God to be used. This is where the story picks up, because Hannah had taken the child, trained the child, weaned the child, and given him back to Eli. What's really scary about this story is here's Eli. He was the pastor, but you ever heard those stories about pastors' kids? He had two really bad ones. Phineas and Hophni. These guys were so bad, God is going to judge Eli. And so what happens? We've got Samuel, who is now living in the presence of his adopted father. Now, I don't know very many of you.
But have any of you ever adopted a child? Or maybe you are one of families. This story is for you as well as all of you who have traditional gifts. Because you see, in this story, Samuel was sent off to live with Eli. But Hannah had not only birthed Samuel, he had trained him on how he's supposed to live. Look at this story with me, would you please? In 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, it says, the boy Samuel, he ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare, and there were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, he was lying down in his usual place. And the Lamb of God had not yet gone out. Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. But just stop for a second. Can you imagine? Let's just say that this is the temple of the Lord, okay? And this is the ark of God. This is the very presence of Jehovah God for all of Israel. This is the one that we're carried around, okay? Here he is, God's presence to all of Israel, and Samuel's sleeping bag is right here. How cool is that? Sleeping right there by where God's visible presence of all of Israel is. So, Samuel's just laying there. And what's it say? It says in verse 4, then the Lord called, Samuel! Samuel answered, here I am. And he ran to Eli and he said, here I am, you called me. Let's just pretend for a second, okay? Let's just say that little Samuel gets up, he runs to Eli. Okay, Eli, sorry, bad reason. No typecasting here, okay? He runs to Eli and he says, here I am, you called me. And Eli's going to say, I ain't calling you. Of course it. So I go back and lie down. So he went and lay down. But the thing I want to look at is, it says, he ran to Eli. Mom and Dad, when you call your child's name, how often do they run to you? Eli wasn't his own dad. Eli didn't even know how to raise kids. But what happens? Hannah had trained him to be obedient to me. Not only did he run, but he said, first off he says, here I am. So he answered, oh, Dad, here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, here I am, you called me. Eli said, go back and lie down. So he went back and lay down. Now, if, Mom, Dad, this is your child, and he came to you like that, would you kind of like, if you're the child, you'd be thinking, I'm not playing this game. Right? He didn't call me. I know he called me. You know, get the Q-tip out, you know, the hair tunnel shut, you know. What's going on here? Again, verse 6. The Lord called Samuel. Samuel! And Samuel got up and he went to Eli and said, here I am. You called me. I don't even read any attitude there, do you? Second time. My son, Eli said, I did not call. Go back and lie down. Okay. Now, good looking young man, okay? Just sit there and look good. Don't have to do anything, all right? What kind of attitude do you think he had? He's saying anything here, okay? These are rhetorical questions. I don't want to get anybody in trouble, okay? And I don't have any idea where we're going for lunch, but I'll come with you, okay? So that I can follow through and stuff. But here's the kick, is that all of a sudden, if your mom calls you and she says, I didn't call you, and then all of a sudden, you go back and she calls you again, you know you heard her. How many times are you going to play this stupid game? I mean, if I'm a child, I'm not going to play it too much more. I don't want to look so stupid and embarrassed. The point is that it wasn't stupid and embarrassing. This is what how children were taught to obey. This is a picture for our dear wife and our dad over here of how a child should obey. That when you call your child's name, they should immediately respond to you and come to you. And the other thing is, they should have a great attitude on their face. Let me read the story a little bit more here. Verse 7. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. That's a key phrase. Oftentimes when we read a story like this, we just zoom it right past it. I'll come back in just a second. But it says, the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. In my interpretation of New Testament, Samuel had no idea who Jesus Christ was. He had not received salvation yet. And so, even though he was not a believer in God, though he was following God, being trained to follow God, his parents had taught him how to be obedient. Mom and Dad, before your kids come to salvation, they still need to know how to be obedient. They need to know what obedience is. But today, we don't even do that. Obedience, I'm going to show you what it is here in just a second. Let's go on to verse 8. The Lord called Samuel a third time, said, Samuel! And notice what happens. Samuel got up. He went to Eli and he said, okay, Eli, here I am. I know you're playing games with me. Why are you calling me? Tell me. I want to know. I read that. I read the attitude that Eli uses, or that God uses here, and Samuel responds with to Eli, who's not even calling him. He says, here I am. You called me. Then Eli, the bells go off, the sirens ring. He says, he says, it wasn't me. He says, Eli told Samuel, go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went, he lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood there calling as at other times, Samuel! Samuel! And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. Now let me give you the capstone of this whole message. I don't know why, Mom and Dad, you want to teach your kids to be obedient. Oftentimes it's so that it'll make your life easier, but that is the wrong reason. We need to teach our children to be obedient so that when God calls knocking on their door like Samuel, they will listen. Whether it's for salvation or whether it's for whatever purpose God created their lives for. In fact, over in, you can write this one down, we'll look at it later, but in Mark chapter 3, verse 13, it says, Jesus went up on a mountain and he called to him those that he wanted, and they came to him. When do you know when God is going to call your child, whether to be a believer in Jesus Christ or whether to be a servant of Jesus Christ? Have they been trained to listen to God's voice? If they're not trained to obey him like Samuel, then why would they do that? Let's go back to Daniel Webster for just a second. Daniel Webster, he gives us this definition. Samuel was ruled or controlled by Eli. Samuel followed the guidance of Eli. And Samuel was submissive to restraint. If he had an attitude in responding, it didn't matter. He went and he did exactly what his mother wasn't even around taught and trained her to do. Now let's look at 4 specific characteristics of what obedience is. You've got these in your outline. You can write these down. They come right out of chapter 9 of Growing Kids God's Way that Eric Ramseyer teaches. But there's 4 specific characteristics that come right out of the story in my mind. The first one is immediate. When you notice what happened with dearest little Samuel, as soon as he heard that voice call, he got up. He responded, and he got up and he ran to where he was, the voice came from. When you call your child, I didn't hear you the first 2 times. My daughter did that to me once. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. Don't do that to me. But you know what? How many times they must not have heard me. I'll call them again. When you know they were in listening ear. But your children need to respond immediately to you as their earthly father if they're going to respond to their heavenly father. They also need to come to you completely. That means wherever you're at or however you want them to come. If you want them to look you in the eye, which I would think a parent would want, then you need to teach your kids to look you in the eye. What's amazing to me is how many children do not look parents in the eye. They're looking over. They're not even listening. Well, they may have got there, but they're not ready to receive the instruction for which the parent called for. Third, it is without, let me give you this little tidbit first, okay? Immediately and completely. That is the action side, the physical side of obedience. We haven't even talked about the attitude, but that's next. Let's look on to that. Without challenging. No place in the 3 times that Samuel's name is called do I see that he was challenging Eli. I don't even see, number 4, that he complained with him. Both of these are the attitude side of obedience. The point to me is that most parents today, and I'm not just talking about Christian parents, I'm talking about any kind of parent. We've got moral parents that aren't even Christians, but they don't require this. You know why parents don't require this kind of obedience from their children? Because we believe in what's called grace and mercy. We want our kids to be able to have that, well, they'll get to it because they want them to know God. He's all graceful. He's merciful to them. Mom and Dad, when you're teaching a child to be obedient, you don't teach them mercy and grace, you teach them obedience. Okay, I ain't back in minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to go too far, and I was told to be done early. So, let's... Why is getting obedience from children so important? Let's look on a little bit further to 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 11. It says, "And the Lord said to Samuel, See, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from the beginning to the end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them." Do you read into that? Do you read the application for yourself? If we know what God wants us to do in training our children, and we're not doing that, it is contemptible to God. Whoa. "Therefore, I swore to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offerings." Mom and Dad, I want to tell you that God has a plan for every one of your children. You can look at Jeremiah 29:11. Points out that God says, I know I have a plan for your life. He had a plan for Noah, a plan for Adam. He had a plan for everyone in the Bible, and he had a plan for us. The problem is that so many times we live in disobedience instead of obedience, and God can't use us in that way. Your children are not going to get to that plan unless you teach them obedience. And if I can just take a little side note here for just a moment. It is not your pastor's job to teach your children to be obedient. It is his job to preach it, and see, the Sunday school teacher's job to teach it, but it is Mom and Dad's job to teach children to be obedient. Let me take it a little bit further. What stops parents from raising obedient children? Number 1, parents have not taught their children what obedience looks like. Do they really know? I will tell you, when I was starting up raising our children, Carla and I were at the same page. We got this wired, you know. I was going into Kmart, local Kmart store. They got, you know, those little merry-go-rounds, you know, with the horses on it, you know. And Brianna saw it. She's going, "Oh yeah, I'm going over there." She's going over there. And I said, "Brianna, come to Daddy." And she's kept going. And I go, "That's 1. And this guy comes walking beside me and says, "Yeah, I used to count 2. Doesn't work, does it?" And I said, 2. And I could see that her body was moving. And he was just standing there. And I go, 3. She came right just like that. He goes, "See, it does work." And I was so proud of myself. And you know what? I raised my child, little baby. I took the stupid, stinking, growing kids' God's way class, and Ezra said, "Good, she come at 3. Why don't you make her come at 1?" That's what obedience is. 3 is disobedience. When I call her name, like Samuel, it's obedience. But you know what? We don't know what obedience is. We don't train them for that. And we turned around and said, "Okay, we're going to ease up our life." And you know, Mom and Dad, if you're a parent, you got a child, and you raise into first-time obedience, which we're talking about here, your life is so much easier. Second reason why parents don't get obedience is parents are too pickin' busy to train their children. We got so much going on. You know, I got to learn this new cell phone I've got. I've got to figure out how to use the internet, this new program I got for my computer. You know how much stuff takes and steals our time? I was amazed. I was out riding my bicycle in Burlington, where we live in Iowa. And there's a park that's got this nice little riding trail that's around this little lake. And there's this guy out there with this dog out this time of year. And he was training his dog to go through the water over this little island for the prey that the man had shot down. And so he went, got the dog, and the dog would go. Because he had put some stuff on it. And then the dog gets over there, and all of a sudden, and I don't know how he does it, but certain sounds, and that dog would go, but the dog would look back. I was so impressed and so amazed at this dog and how this man has trained this dog. I was going like, how do you do that? So I had to ask. And so I asked him, and I said, is it hard to train a dog like that? He says, no, it took a few months, maybe a year. People are like, okay, wow. I said, well, does it take a lot of time to keep it up? Oh, 15 minutes a day, a couple times a week. I just spend time with them. And I'm going like, if parents would only spend the time to train their children to be obedient, what a difference it would make. A third reason is that parents make excuses for their child's behavior. Oh, they're sick, or they can't do that. I don't see that God made excuses in Colossians 3:20 when it says, children obey your parents in everything. I don't see any excuses in that. But today, instead of following Proverbs 22:6, it says, train up a child the way he should go. Parents are training the children the way they will go, not the way they should go. Number 4, parents do not mean what they say and say what they mean. They lecture. You know why parents lecture? We talk about this a lot this afternoon. Parents lecture because they think through their great oratorical skills, they're going to be able to convince their child to do what they've already taught them to do. It's like, why don't they? And you think with just a little bit more emphasis, a little bit more yelling, obey. It doesn't happen. Okay? It takes obedience. Number 5, parents try to be friends with their children instead of training the child. It's amazing. Kids are kids. Parents are parents. But yet we're trying to get down to the level and say, just be my friend and you will do it, okay? I know if you're friendly with me, you'll do what you're supposed to do. So how to get your child to be obedient? Give you a couple more steps here, okay? Number 1, you got to have a plan. That's why I love this Great Kids class. If you haven't taken one, I encourage you. If you got friends that need to, convince them. Bring it tonight. I'll talk them into it. Number 2, you got to rely on your spouse. It's amazing to me how many times my wife knew what I saw what I didn't see. She could actually see that I wasn't bringing my children to obedience. And I could see what she's doing. But it's a whole lot easier not to help them out, just to keep on doing what I'm doing. But God gives parents, husband and wife, to work together. And that way, 2 against 1, you surprise every child. Okay? Just if you're working together, you can do it. Number 3, don't give up on what you know is right. We had parents that were telling us our standard of obedience was too strict when I started out as a youth pastor. And we backed off. Proverbs 3:5 says, trust in the Lord and lean not on your own understanding. If I look at the Bible, here's what an obedient child is. Number 4, it needs to be consistent. Inconsistency is the greatest peril to parents' training. And number 5, James chapter 5, verse 16, effective prayer, a righteous man can do much. How often, mom and dad, do you really pray for your children? Not because they're in trouble, or praying because you want to get them to do something, but praying for God's will in their lives. I'm going to skip this next section, but it's got some really good stuff in it. Why does obedience please the Lord? There's some really good stuff here in 1 Samuel. Maybe you can read it later, but let me tell you. And kind of build off where your pastor's been and where he's going, if I can for a second. What would happen if Hannah had not taught Samuel to be obedient? You're going into Noah. What would happen if Noah's parents did not teach him to be obedient? I don't know if you realize it, but Noah had a terrific legacy. I hope you look at it. I hope you show short with him. Because when you look at the influence into Noah, he needed that godly heritage. So standing back here, his grandfather actually knew, walked and talked with Adam. That's an amazing thing. So you had Adam standing up here going, hey, you know what? Tell your sons, tell your grandsons to do this. Why? I need to skip to another slide. Turn over in that slide to Psalm chapter 71, verse 18. When I look out at this audience, I see a blessed heritage. Many of you have Medicaid blonde hair. And it's very beautiful. The point that I would like to make is this next verse I'd like to read to you. Because I've been talking to parents and children, hopefully you will listen, because I hope your parents start working with you. The Psalm 71:18 says this, and this is one of David's charges to people. His testimony was, even when I am old and I am gray, do not forsake me, O God, until I declare your power to the next generation, your might to all who are coming. For those of you that don't have children, it is not retirement age on earth. That is heaven. Today's children, today's teenagers need your teaching. They need your encouragement. They need your influence. They need your impact on their lives as to what does an obedient child look like. What does it mean to walk with the Lord? When I grew up in Sunday school, I can tell you Mrs. Dodson made a huge impact on me. And I don't mean to offend anybody, but she was old, wrinkled, and gray. And I looked at her, with respect. She taught my Sunday school class when I was in 3rd grade and when I was in 6th grade. And you know what she taught me? She taught me the Bible. And I'm going, today I preach to you because of Mrs. Dodson. I can give you names of far more that were like her. That's Griffin. And how she was just always there encouraging me when I walked through the door of the church. I wasn't going to be a preacher. God had other plans. I would tell you that when I grew up in the church, I grew up in this time frame, the 60s and 70s. Some of you can think back to what that era was like. It was the hippie generation, you know, where the sex and drugs just flowed. And I have friends that I went to youth group with, a group at a church about this size. And I can tell you that I had friends that walked away from the Lord. But not only did I have friends that walked away from the Lord, we actually had families that left the church because it was the gray hairs in our church that didn't have the answers at that time. They couldn't stand up and say, thus saith the Lord. And I just wanted to plead with you. We need you. The Church of Jesus Christ today has got so many young people that have got no foundation and no roots in the Scriptures. They're coming from all over the place. They don't really know what's right or wrong, but we need to know God's power. And if you look at this verse one more time, it says, even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, O God, until I declare your power. That is the Old Testament, who God was, to the next generation and your might. What God can do to the next generation to come. These children, these teenagers, these young families, they need the teaching. They need the strong encouragement from the elderly, from the wisdom, from those of you who have lived for Christ all your lives. Please stand up and let this younger generation know. Influence them with who God is and what He can do and what you've seen Him do in this year's past. Let me wrap up with just a little bit more here. Closing illustration would be this. You probably have heard this. That Jesus said that we need to be the light of the earth. The light of the world is salt of the earth. What's interesting is that parents, your children can be a huge testimony. My son was 10 or 11 years old, it seems Michael, and then Carla was sitting in the stands watching he's just watching the game. I was umpiring the game. And Brianna and Amy, who at that time were, I think they were like 8 and 4, and they were just sitting there in the stands. And they got bored, Carla could see that. There's this playground over here, you know. And they said, can we go play on the playground? And It's just, community baseball field, probably like what you got. So they go over there, and Carla, because she had trained them in obedience, after about 10 minutes, she just wanted to make sure they're okay. No problem. She said, Brianna, yes, Mommy, I'm coming. Shh. Amy, yes, Mommy, I'm coming. Shh. And he come right over there and said, how you doing? You having fun? Oh, yeah, we're having so much fun, Mom. And, I said, well, give me a hug and go back and play some more. What these girls didn't see and Carla didn't see until after they went back and played was 7 pairs of eyes. All mothers of kids playing on the Lily field say, how'd you do that? How did you get those kids to do that? Can you do that again, Carla? She said, sure. Brianna, yes, Mommy, I'm coming. Shh. Amy, yes, Mommy, I'm coming. Shh. And I'm like, how'd you do that? It's the greatest thing, Those people got into a growing kids class, and a couple years later, they call their kids, shh, and the same thing happens. You want to open the eyes of people to who Jesus Christ is? Train a child to be obedient. Train a child to be respectful. Train a child to be responsible for God's word and let the world be amazed at who God is. I've been talking about obedience this way, but I want to give you one other verse. I don't know if you can go back to it on the screen, but it's in 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. This may be a verse that you know. It says, blank, blank, blank. Do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. Hopefully a familiar verse to you. What's interesting is it says, do not conform to the evil desires you have when you lived in ignorance. How can we not do that? Only as obedient children. Mom and Dad, Christians of any age, you want to do what God called you to do, then you got to be an obedient child. Obedient to His Word, obedient to the Father. So when He has something for you to do, you say, yes, Lord, here I am. What would you like me to do? Heavenly Father, I'd like to just thank you for the privilege of just sharing these books today. And I pray, Father, that for what I've shared, that your Holy Spirit would have been pricking and prodding and teaching each individual part here from what you want that to work. For God, it's your word and not mine. It's the teaching that you gave us on how we need to be obedient. Our children only can be obedient to you, Father, if we teach them that. So, Father, we realize that to raise obedient children, we have to first be obedient to you. And I pray, Father, that every area here would be about how they need to be seeking you, being obedient to your word and calling. Lord, I pray that you would bless this church. I pray that you would bless their pastor, and that they would seek to be